So, welcome back, everybody. This is season 2, episode 5 of Lessons from Terrible Students. We are the Terrible Students. As always, my name is Jeremy. That over there is Sarah. Anybody that is joining us on our YouTube channel, you may notice there's an additional face. We will introduce him in just a little bit. Don't worry about him right now. So, today we are going to be talking about what we are referring to as work personality tests. They've been referred to as a few different things, personality inventories, a whole bunch of different kind of categories for these different type of tests. Essentially, these things that you take to determine what type of employee you are. And there's many different reasons why you may end up being in kind of one of these group activities to take one of these tests. But we're going to dive a little deeper into these and what their purpose is and kind of what the positive and negatives in these tests are. But before we get into all of that, as always, this podcast is brought to you by Lumius. At Lumius, we are your partner in learning. Welcome back, everybody. So like I said, we have an additional talking head with us today. With us today is Dr. Emory Daniel. So Dr. Emory Daniel is an associate professor at Appalachian State University here in North Carolina. Say hello, Doctor.
Hello, Doctor. I can't help myself. Couldn't help myself.
So the doc here has thankfully agreed to jump on and help us kind of dive into some of the details around how these tests are kind of made and researched and all that kind of stuff. Kind of dips into his background. Dr. Danielle and I, we go back just way back because we're both very old. Way back into the early aughts when we were in college together in 2000. When did I meet you?
In the early 2000s.
2004-ish.
Yeah, 2003.
Yeah.
McAllister Dorm, Lees McRae College.
That's right. That's right. So he has agreed to come on and kind of discuss some of these things with us. But before we do all of that, I wanted to give him a chance to introduce himself, and now's the time to do that. So, Doctor, what you got for us?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. This is something that I really enjoyed talking about over my years in graduate school. So as Jeremy mentioned, my name is Dr. Emory Stephen Daniel. Yes, working with 3 first names, which is lovely and confusing all at the same time. I am an associate professor at Appalachian State University. I teach a lot of advertising courses, and a lot of my research focuses on the meta part of research, which ultimately looks at types of methodology, research design, and I've had a lot of experience being able to go over these and do my own additional research on understanding why we do the studies that we do and the effectiveness of those, because it's very important to not only discuss how we do certain things, but also be able to talk about it in reporting, so that you just don't hear a study says, for instance, and then just see it as credible and viable and not taking things without a grain of salt. So that's something that I really enjoy doing. And obviously with this kind of thing, taking this kind of information and bring it into a practical outlet, both positive and negative, is something I'm really excited to talk about. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. And thanks for joining us. So I'm going to start this episode off with kind of a personal anecdote and kind of why we chose this particular topic. So these work personality tests, there's a few of them. We're not really going to focus on any one particular one. I think most people are aware of what we're talking about, but just in case, there's ones called like the Hogan inventory. There's the Myers-Briggs, there's the DISC, there's just all kind of these things out there. And I think most people that have worked in the corporate environment for any number of years have probably taken one or more than one of these at some point in their career.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the reason that these things kind of stick in my mind is because for those of you that have listened to the earlier episodes of the podcast, I came out of a field ops area obviously they were not going to pay for us to do that while I was a field technician. So my first exposure to one of these was my first year as a corporate employee, when I became a training content specialist, and it was relatively negative. So they brought us all in to our first big team building experience. I was probably 4 or 5 months out of the field, really still kind of getting my sea legs and trying to figure out what I was doing, and not really understanding what was going on. They're like, "Hey, go take this personality test with all of the rest of these corporate folks that have been doing this for 10, 15 years. What could go wrong?" So essentially, what went wrong? So in this particular one, it divides you into kind of 4 different buckets, and what they wanted to do was have each one of these different buckets stand in a different section of the room to begin with, to kind of show. So we got our test results back, and each one you found out which bucket you were in. They were like, okay, now for our group activities, let's go have you join up with people that kind of landed in the same bucket that you landed in. Yeah, guess who was standing in a corner by himself? So I did
You were
probably the
Mr.
next
Bucket.
hour and a half of group activity by myself, because I was the only one in that bucket. Because I mean, we weren't a huge team, but yeah. So, and there was no, and now as an instructional designer, I know that this facilitator did not do a fantastic job in facilitating the course either, because there should have been some changes made on the fly. But I know that now as a terrible student. I didn't know that then. I just kind of sat and did my quiet work all by myself, already kind of self-conscious of, well, maybe I shouldn't actually be here. So I do like to state my bias up front. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this episode, and I'd like to kind of state that up front of, I have had negative experiences with these. So when I look at these, work personality inventories or personality tests, things like that, it is always from a more cynical point of view of, is this something that's really going to be helpful? Is this something that's really going to be needed? That type of thing. So that's kind of where I wanted to start. I don't know if you two have kind of a similar, or God, I hope you don't have a worse experience, but I don't know if you have a similar experience.
I don't have a worse experience, Jeremy. I would just say, I think I've found the benefit of them before, but I've also seen how they can also be a little negative in a way, right? I think I told you we used to have to put our personality scores with our signatures at a previous job to try and if you were working with somebody new, that would give them the opportunity of being like, oh, well, Sarah's a 2246, so maybe I can anticipate this about her. And so that's all fine and dandy, except for one of my biggest problems with personality tests is that I don't think folks are that self-aware. And so I don't necessarily trust the validity of their scores.
What? No.
I know,
Come
right?
on.
I know.
Okay, we've had 2 hot takes this episode already. One is you can't believe everything on the internet. I don't believe that at all. And 2 is people aren't self-aware. Come on.
How dare we? I know. You were just talking about cynical, and I was like, Jeremy, cynical? What?
No.
No way.
No, you can't see it, right?
But no, I can see, I think they're intended in a positive way to grow connection and help people understand each other. But at the root of it, I don't know that they are super always true. I don't know that people really answer them as truthfully as they should. That's my problem with them.
And I think you make a really good point with that, Sarah, in terms of the self-awareness that we have and how much we're actually able to assess ourselves and how truthful we are when we know we're being tested, for instance. I share that cynicism as well, Jeremy, that while I never really had an incorporation where these, kind of personality tests were used in a work environment, I'm in academia where I'm surrounded with people that are the well, actually, kind of mentality. And so the mere mention of some of these tests will get some people's blood boiling, uh, because they do what I do, which is they do research design and they do methodology. And when they talk about not only how it's brought into fruition as well as how it's reported, it gets their blood boiling. Because if we continue on with some of the problems here, we also talk about this whole mentality, especially with surveys and questionnaires, more
Mhm.
specifically quantitative research. We always kind of mention this. Well, the numbers don't lie, and I've always had a major reservations with that phrase of how people like I love statistics and I know the numbers don't lie, and I'm like, can you tell the difference between a chi-square and a t-test? When it comes to, and those are very simple measures within statistics. But the thing of it is that when we get to the numbers don't lie and that mentality of it, it's like, yes, numbers typically don't lie, but the people that create them can influence them to go their way in quite a various amount of ways. So that's where something that I always have reservations,
Right.
especially when I see quantitative research being stated as something as fact. And again, qualitative research has this same problem, but questionnaires are often not easy to make, but people make them easily,
Hmm.
and they
Good point.
also kind of share them in such a way that we got these measures really fast and we're treating them as fact. And there's a lot of confirmation we need to do before we can treat them that way.
Hmm.
That's a good point. A good take on creating quiz questions. And how easy it is for people to make them, but are they good questions? Are they leading?
Yeah,
You
all of
know,
these things come into my dissertation chair always told me it's like it's easy to make a questionnaire. It is incredibly difficult to make a good one.
right.
Hmm. So one of the things I did want to go into kind of a little bit is overall intent behind some of these tests. So there's two kind of schools of thought about what these work personality inventories or personality tests or whatever label they want to put on them. In my experience, there's been two kind of intents behind the people that make these tests. One I feel is okay. I've stated my bias up front. I still don't quite agree with it, but I find it kind of okay-ish. The other I am entirely against. So the okay-ish one is kind of having your team do it as a team building event and kind of using it as kind of building rapport. Maybe you have a new manager or maybe you've hired a couple of new people. So you do this and kind of have people answer these questionnaires to figure out how the team can work better together. And how these folks will interact with each other and all that kind of stuff. I'm more okay with kind of that way than I am about kind of the other more insidious way, which using any of these type of tests. And I think for a while this was done a lot, and I know it was done from what I've read about the Myers Briggs as far as using it for promotions or any kind of HR decision. So as far as team building, I get it as long as you're taking the results with like a grain of salt. There's a couple of things that could change your results and all that kind of thing. But so I did kind of want to get your thoughts, Doc, on kind of how these things came around and kind of what you know about how they were built and researched to begin with.
So I'm not going to mention like any one particular scale with that. And I often think when it comes to creation of these kind of ideas, I always like to kind of give the best of intentions with a lot of these. Is that the scholars that were doing them, you know, wanted to bring out some area of truth, and it is as infinitesimal as it may be, very small little blip on the scale of knowledge that they're trying to assess and create and invent. So I always kind of give researchers, for instance, a little bit of the benefit of the doubt of, trying to create something. And then some things with research become very popular as confirmatory studies or studies that kind of continuously look at the same phenomena get reproduced. Then it's something that might get out of hand. And this is where you get people that are very interested in science, but may not have the scope, for instance, to know exactly what goes into it. I remember seeing a Facebook page, for instance, that was called I effing love science. And there's a part of it where I was like, in terms of creating measurements, going through peer review on multiple occasions, getting your feelings hurt so many times of peer review, for instance, and just failing over and over and over again. I referenced y'all's podcast and just kind of had a moment of like clarity of like, oh my gosh, how many times I failed on one stupid study that finally got published. And it was something that the more I looked into it, I do think that these are in a situation, just someone trying to, trying to understand and convey a small truth. That said, the way that it's utilized is we have, for instance, a lot of personality tests that have scales. So you can look at something like, I always go by, because I'm a communication scholar, introversion and extroversion. Right. Where do you fall within that scale, right? And so that's inherently fine by itself, as long as A, the measurement actually accurately defines introversion and extroversion, and B, it's reported in such a way that it is on a scale. But that's not what happens in a lot of reporting of it. It gets grouped as, are you an introvert or are you an extrovert?
Right.
And it becomes those two things, to where I would say, oh, well, I'm an extrovert. And then you would have to say to yourselves, well, what does that mean? And you might ask yourselves, like, what goes into being an introvert or an extrovert? And, Sarah, Jeremy, you might have two similar but also different definitions.
Yeah.
And that's inherently fine, but it stems a problem with reliability, because if they are different, those definitions mean a lot to people. And it also is a big deterrent for people, how they interpret them. So again, Sarah, as you were mentioning, for instance, this whole idea of kind of self-reflexivity, as well as being able to understand your own self-reporting, I would sit there and go, man, introversion and extroversion means something totally different to me, versus if I help explain it and say, this is what I mean when I say extroversion, when you're showing it to a participant. So, and the last thing I'll say, that these results can't exist in a vacuum. We can't take these, again, quantitative measures and just say, oh, this person's an extrovert. I get really shy in certain situations, particularly when I don't know the conversation. And I will sit there and go, yes, if I'm talking about certain areas like the things behind me here, which is a lot of anime and gaming stuff. Yeah, I'm a chatterbox. But then when you get into other things, I would sit there and go, I don't get charged by other topics. And that's where my introversion comes in, to where I'm like, I was talking about something for like 45 minutes, I had no invested interest in, and I was exhausted. So those definitions matter. And also it's kind of the grouping component of it that I have a big problem with, because if you're, for instance, say I'm 46% introverted, 54% extroverted, and you lump me in as an extrovert, that's pushing it. And you might get to where you're sitting alone, like poor Jeremy, that he just wants to find a place to be with, other like-minded people in those groupings. And again, gosh, that just boils my blood. And it's also like morbidly hilarious. The way that
I
you
look back
mentioned
on
that.
it now as funny, right? It really did. It was, it was the definition of imposter syndrome at the time, where it was like, because
Mhm. Totally. I get
and
it.
I don't know if I've shared the story about how I got out of the field into that particular job, but I was actually, so I applied for the job and got an automated rejection from the recruiter for the job that I eventually got. But the recruiter's email was like, it wasn't from the system, it was from the actual recruiter. So what I
Mm.
did was I took the job description and I peeled pieces of it out and pieces of my resume and put them side by side to where I actually matched with the job description. And at the end, the last line was just, tell me how I don't match this job. Um, and the recruiter sent that email to the hiring manager, and that's how I got an interview. Um, so to this day, if it wasn't for that particular hiring manager, I'd probably still be climbing poles and crawling under houses. But it was shortly after that where I felt like I bullied my way into this job, and now I'm sitting by myself in a corner. Right, I'm like, this imposter syndrome is hitting me pretty hard. At that point, I don't even know if it was imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome, you actually have to know what you're doing. I didn't know what I was doing at that point. It was just full on imposter at that point because they were teaching me a good bit of it. So yeah, it was. I look back on it and laugh now, but it was a rough day.
I never heard that story. I think that's awesome though that you did that.
I was fed up, man. I really was because I was, I had never planned on that technician job being my full time career, and I'd been at it, 7 years at that point. I'm like, man, this is crap, man. I got to get out of this. So
We're done. We're done.
yeah,
Yeah. I got
I was
that.
trying to get training jobs, and that one had come open, and I was like, I knew it was my foot in the door. So it was either that or drive down there and talk to them. I'm like, I don't think they would like me showing up on their doorstep. So we're gonna try this other thing. I got lucky.
There
Like the 95 theses and just put both on their window or something.
Right. So, but yeah, and again, and I don't think I would probably score the same on that particular test. I know I wouldn't score the same on that particular test now because that was almost 10 years ago. That was 2014, and now we're 2023, where I'm a completely different person now than I was then, just because of life experiences and things like that. Which is something else with these, if to do them and keep them accurate across. And I would say it's, the one thing that I keep coming back to is, and I've mentioned it on this podcast a few times, 2020, the year 2020 to me changed everything.
For sure.
Everything that happened, the COVID thing happened, the Black Lives Matter thing happened. I'll say COVID happened worldwide, and then the country that we live in had, just a huge amount of shift all over the place.
Right.
So I immediately have skepticism for anything that was created prior to that, because I feel like anything that doesn't take into account those type of changes, like these things that were created prior to 2020, before all of, I say everybody was made aware of this, but even that speaking from privilege, right? Like there was a good segment of the population that was well and truly aware of how things were.
Right.
It's just there were some of us that weren't. So that's kind of my other thing that I have. Like these things, I don't think get, and this may be my ignorance showing, but I don't think they get updated very often as well, because I've taken a few of them multiple times, and I swear it's the same questions over and over again. Now, I don't know if their judging standards change behind the scenes, because, they keep all of that in their little magic box, and, I don't know what they're doing back there. So who knows?
That's a good point, though, Jeremy, about we all change, we all evolve. The pandemic definitely made me far more of an introvert than I ever was. I'm probably still classified as an extrovert, but
Yeah,
I don't know on
definitely.
the scale of what I would be, Dr. Daniel. But Um, but for the most part, but yeah, everything changed, right? And I think about when I was taking these personality tests, like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed into corporate America at 27. Like now I'm jaded. Things have changed. I have seen some things. So I'm right there with you, though. That is something I think about too. Is how often are companies having their people take these? Um, so many things changed from the year 2020, even in just 3 years to 2023. Like, are they doing it that frequently, or and are the questions ever updated? That's also a good point. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, often not that they don't change because they don't want the reliability and the validity to change because
Mm.
they've written them out and they've been tested and they have so many
Right.
people that are taking them. But I mean, y'all make a spectacular point about the notion of truth, for instance, and that's really heavy topic of what we could be talking about here. But there are these things that are called paradigm shifts, and and ultimately is what we knew as truth back before 2020 when we were again doughy-eyed and bushy-tailed versus our jaded personalities now. And I mean, this can even be for how many years you've had in your work experience,
Right.
for instance. So me as a lecturer at Coastal Carolina University versus me at App State. Oh, I've changed.
Yeah.
But it also brings the complication for things like longitudinal studies and why academics hate doing them. Um, because if you're trying to go for tenure, for instance, longitudinal studies could be a death sentence for you because they take forever to do. They're incredibly great if you can do them effectively, but you have things like dropout, you have people changing, you have things that you have to figure out when you're doing like how you want to change your instruments and so forth. There are a lot of variables that go into it. And so there are things where I can see, for instance, why we don't change these things up. But at the same time, it's necessary
Why we
sometimes.
should. You right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't like it didn't even cross my mind that if they were to change a few of the questions, now they have to go back and make sure that all of like the test results and the research methodologies and all that still fit with the changes. I figured you just change a few of the questions up because I know that some of these tests, I assume that some of these tests are, um, kind of pointed towards our demographic, kind of the corporate America demographic. Um, and there used to be a term for it. I cannot for the life of me remember what it is now, but basically like the middle age, middle income kind of demographic is kind of who these tests are designed around. So those on the YouTube channel, Dr. Daniel's laughing at me for some reason. Yeah, we're middle aged. I hate to tell you,
No,
like did that suffice?
Technically.
Yeah,
I'm laughing because yeah, the sample size, it makes a big difference on some of these things, and if it's not intended for those audiences, so like if you're writing something towards a someone that's just entering the workforce versus person that's 10-15 years into it, you're going to get some different interpretations
right.
of it. And
Yeah,
so
Absolutely.
these terms are going to be very different to a person that's just starting versus a person 15 years. And I'm laughing because can be a problem within academia is that it's hard to recruit people that aren't in academia. So, we can't always have people that are PhDs, for instance, in our sample set. We can't always have students to a point where one of my favorite studies talking about this said college students aren't real people. And I read that and I laughed hysterically. And I had to talk to somebody like, what did they mean by that? And they're basically saying that it's not a one size fit all audience. Can't do it.
That's
You
true.
have to make sure that you cater for the people that are in some degree um, going to be at certain cycles within their life, certain cycles within their career. But people don't do that. Why? And not always, but because it's hard. It's hard to come up with these things. It's hard to come up with new definitions. it's exhausting, and I do have experience with that. Of like, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Well, it is, and I have other experience where some of these tests were used in HR decisions, and for example, at a company that I worked at, there was one that they used for manager promotions. So, when it came down to the final 2 to 3 candidates, they would pay for all 3 of them to take one of these personality inventories, and then it wouldn't solely be based on that, but that would be in the factoring decision and be taken into account in choosing the final candidate. And I really did have a pretty big problem with that, primarily because, a lot of times those 2 to 3 candidates, you would have somebody from like the corporate side versus somebody from kind of like the less corporate side. So somebody from maybe manufacturing side or distribution side or something like that. And I just knew from my own personal experience that more than likely, I mean, maybe they did great. I don't know. I don't know how they did on these tests. I was not privy to that. I just knew that they were using this test. But more than likely, the person that was, you know, in the field, quote unquote, to bring it back to my terminology, more than likely they had never taken one of those tests before. So this was kind of their first foray into taking one, and they had a lot riding on it. And I did not feel like that was fair to them, that it is used as any kind of promotional decision. So that's one hot take that I wanted to make sure we touched on. And again, I'm not going to mention any specifically. I'm not going to say, this one's good, this one's bad, or whatever. I don't think any of them, point blank across the board, should be used in any kind of hiring or firing decision
No.
ever. I don't think that I may be wrong. This is my personal opinion, but I don't think that any of them are good enough to be able to base somebody's future on, is my opinion.
And as long
So,
as you have a human answering questions about themselves, like, or human interference in any way, right? And manipulating data and being able to, if that were a factor, that just feels very, it feels too easy to manipulate something like that to make it work in your favor. Did you guys know that that was a deciding factor before taking the personality tests?
yeah, they so when they got, so not when they applied for the
Even
job.
more
So
so.
what would happen is they would apply and they would go through the first interview. The first interview would knock out all but like 2 or 3 candidates. And then
Mm.
those 2 or 3 candidates would have to go and take this. And it's not like a simple, hey, what Hogwarts house are you? It's like an in-depth test, right? Like it's 150 some odd questions, and like it's a sit down, and it's going to take you a couple hours to go through this thing, and it's Likert scales and all kind of ridiculous stuff. Because I did end up having to take the test because when I did end up expressing my discontent that we were using this thing. So they're like, well, why don't you get certified on this test? I told them that was not a good idea, and then they made me do it anyway. So, but
Then you had to facilitate other people taking this test.
I did, yeah.
Even better. That's not going to
Good
throw
Lord.
any, indicating factors in the whole process for the people you were training either,
I did.
fact-
I was part of 2 interviews where I did the post of, hey, do you think this person fits? I always said yes. I didn't even I would do because at the end there's like a coaching feedback session after the fact. I would always do that to how the book and all that said, because that's, they're doing it, so I might as well put my best into it. I'm going to do the best I can. I would give them everything that all the science in this book told me to do, and then I would refer them to the job, regardless of what the test said. Like, I'm going to refer everybody that comes across, because I don't think this should be a gating factor for anything. And I don't know this man or woman from Adam or Eve, so I'm going to say that this is not going to bar you. So, and we're just going to rely on your experience and your interview to go from there, because I don't think it ever should have been in the conversation to begin with. So
Nice.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah, and you know that it is ridiculous, and that's why I wanted to bring it up here. I don't, again, the two ways that I've seen these tests used. One is team building. I'm all for, if you want to do this as far as team building and getting to know yourself, getting to know your team members, that's great. But again, I compare it to the online personality test. What Hogwarts house are you, or what? To me, it's kind of on the same level, right? Like it's just a longer version of that, But
You're
when it
you're
when
not
it
a Gryffindor.
comes,
You might as well get out. We do not tolerate anybody that does not include bravery as their top attributing characteristic
That's
towards
right.
this job. Screw your loyalty, Hufflepuff.
but so I mean that's just kind of, and again, I stated my bias up front. These are my opinions. There may be something that I am unaware of. There may be some type of science behind it. Again, there may be, something that I am ignorant of that changes my opinion. As of right now, that's what my opinion is. So but I keep an open mind. Like I try to read as much as I can. If something changes my mind, then I'll be sure to let you know. But I don't see it happening anytime soon.
I mean, this is, for instance, with the graduate record examination, the GRE, and the SAT, some schools don't even require it anymore.
Really?
Yeah, I want to say that Wake Forest, for instance, was one of the first schools that got rid of the SAT because certain things. Now, granted, this is not a personality test, obviously,
Right.
but is this going to actually gauge the success that you're going to have in your undergrad or graduate school? And that is a variable where you have to think about it within your career. For instance, is this going to gauge, for instance, and there's so many outside factors of it. How I'm feeling that day. Like I've been sick when I've taken some of these tests, and for instance, and I would sit there and go, yeah, my answer is going to change based if I'm feeling better, or something as small as, and this is talked a lot about within lab experimental research, is whoever is the person that it's administrating the experiment or the survey, their mood, for instance,
100%.
can have a very deterring factor for the participant. So, if I'm coming in there and, Jeremy, we're fresh off an argument about taking this test in the first place, the fact that you may be angry will affect your results.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, I could absolutely see that. And I haven't thought about the SATs in so long, but I forgot that the SAT is supposed to like measure your capacity for success. And I know some people are squirrely about saying what they made on the SAT. I don't care. It was forever ago. I made it 1100 on my SAT, which is, I think, average. Like, it's not great, but it's average, right? So, but all I remember is my girlfriend at the time, wife now, made better than I did, and she made sure to make sure I knew that. So all
really now, I cannot imagine. I've known her for about as long as I've known you. She wouldn't do something like that. Don't deceive the people listening to this.
She listen. I tell my wife all the time the main reason I married her is because she's smarter than I am. So that's
good reason.
Yeah. Same, by the way.
Yeah. So, but I completely forgot that that's kind of the reason. And the SAT itself, to bring it into this conversation as well, it's been under some pretty big scrutiny as well for being biased, and and I think even back to shortly after we graduated college, I think that conversation got started about the SAT being, because then they tried to add an essay to it, and then it went up to like 2,400 points or something like that. I don't even know what it is anymore. I guess I should figure that out. My kid's gonna have to take.
Now they have an ACT.
ACT, yeah.
No.
all of this conversation, though, the more we dig into it and talk about it and bring up all these variables, just, kind of proves your point, Jeremy, about the cynicism or your thoughts about these tests and their accuracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, all of these tests. I'm sure they have. I think they're made with the best intentions, like Dr. Daniel said. I think the original intent behind them is good. I don't think anybody. I hope nobody makes these tests going, I'm going to make $1 million and make people's lives miserable, right? I don't think that's the intent.
I mean, maybe the first part.
Right. I think there's some type of good intention behind all of them. It does, I believe, come in the in the implementation of it and how each company decides to use it and how they actually take the test and read the results and use those results within the company. I think that's where we start to see kind of the negative experiences, like the one I've had. Like I said, now I can look back on it and laugh, and I know that that it wasn't necessarily the test itself why I had a negative experience. It was more of that person giving the class not being able to change on the fly, and it was my kind of background experience coming in and kind of the baggage I was carrying coming in, tainting that experience as well. So, but again, it's still in my head. Like that was still my first experience with this, so it's hard to get past that type of thing.
I have a question for Dr. Daniel. Can you name or what are the positives of these personality tests? What do you think what are they good for? Do you think they're good in any capacity?
I mean, I know people have used them in a variety of different ways. I've known professors, for instance, that would talk about how they've used them to find their romantic partner, for instance, because they saw similarities within the personalities, and they would use like these acronyms or numbers to kind of help utilize that. And I don't know that I agree with that. I will say that this particular couple that I'm thinking of is still married. They're doing very, very well. And so, there's a part of me that's like, maybe I don't know as much as I think I do about the utility of these.
Yep, sample size of one. It sounds good to me. That's 100%. What's the problem?
As far as their uses are concerned, though, I think there are some areas, like Jeremy said, of being able to, for instance, get started with some communication, for instance, amongst perceivably like-minded people might be very helpful. But in the same respect, I mean, I don't know why we're going into like Hogwarts test here. The Slytherins always get isolated.
Side train.
The Slytherins always get, ostracized for the rest as being the bad one, for instance, when all they want is a little bit of ambition, for instance. So anyway, but that is the kind of thing where I don't see a whole lot of use practically for a lot of these personality tests. Just because, again, the whole construct of finding things in a vacuum, for instance, of, I don't, Jeremy, I would be with you of doing the exact same thing of if I were doing these personality tests and administrating them and evaluating them, the thing I would say is I'd probably take a note of them. I'd still probably pass them along because I really want to see what else is there. And this is why things like mixed methodology, where we do qualitative and quantitative studies, for instance, are so valuable because it gives that extra push, for instance, of saying, here's the context of why this person, you might say, well, this person is a team player versus they work exclusively only alone, for instance. And I've had professors that would sit there and go, so they work well alone. What's wrong with that?
Right.
And right. Challenge it. And I was like, man, I really like this devil's advocate perception of it, of why don't we ask said person of why they have 45 solo pieces and never once worked with anybody else. And contextually, in their field, it only made sense because that's how they publish, is everybody just goes solo author. Whereas my profession, it doesn't do that. I'm going a little off track here, but the whole component of it, though, is I think they can be a good starting block in conversation, but I'm with you, Jeremy. I don't think they need to be an exclusive focus on making major decisions on people's career and their lives, for that matter.
Yeah,
Again, sample size of one.
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. Yeah, and it is what it is. Like I said, I'll keep an open mind. Obviously, there's tons of these things out there. There may be one out there that checks all of my boxes, and I just haven't learned about it yet. We'll say I'm skeptical or cynical, as Sarah likes to call me. But I doubt it's there. But who knows? We'll see.
I doubt it's there, but anyway. There it is.
Yeah, but on a final parting note, Dr. Daniel, I want to say I appreciate you stopping by and talking to us. As always, it's been great talking to you. I'm sure I'll find another reason to have you on. I'll pick another topic that we'll talk about, and we'll get you back on again. I appreciate it. Any last thoughts about our subject of work personality tests or anything else?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me, and please find an excuse to have me back, because not only do we need to hang out more, I love talking about this kind of stuff. So as long as y'all are having fun and listeners seem to enjoy it, I'm all about it. My parting words, if you will, is we like science to fit. And we like it to fit in these nice little shapes, and like them to fit in these nice little labels, for instance. And science is really messy. And I honestly, I've been racking my brain since we talked last, if I could come up with a better analogy, and I can't for the one that I thought up with, and it's really stupid. But I said science.
Hey, we specialize in stupid. Let's do it.
All right, you ready? You ready for this? Science, to me, is like chewing tobacco. I've only done it once, but the problem was I tried dip, and it's supposed to fit in this nice little part right here. By the way, it was disgusting. Don't recommend. But when I put it in there, and I figured, again, nice little label that was going to sit in the corner of my mouth right here, that sucker went all over the place. And it was disgusting. And I kept going back to my mind of that analogy, because I want science to fit. I want science to be in these nice little labels, but it doesn't. There are outliers everywhere.
Yeah.
And, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the Kubler-Ross Stages of Grief, and I know I told y'all this when we were talking beforehand. Yep. She's like, look, you think it's an order. It's not. It's not this denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We repeat steps. We omit steps. We skip steps, and we, sometimes don't even come to this whole thing with acceptance. So, we always have to really be careful when it comes to science, especially when trying to fit people into labels, because it just doesn't work that way. And there are always going to be outliers, and there are always going to be inconsistencies. And that's where, oh boy, I'm going to throw on a big academic hat here. This is where Carl Sagan used to say science thrives on failure. And it's one of my favorite lines of all time, because we constantly have to evolve. And that's what makes it so awesome. But it also makes it incredibly frustrating.
Indeed.
I like that. I'm gonna use that quote too. That's good stuff.
He's a smart one, I hear. That Carl Sagan.
He's kind of a smart guy,
he right? Like he rings a bell in my head, right? That's
heard good things about him.
Yeah.
I think they mentioned him on Big Bang Theory one time. That's right.
Total Ravenclaw, As we explore,
we have some Harry Potter fans in the audience.
That's fun. But all right, well, again, Dr. Daniel, I appreciate you talking to us. That'll do it for this episode. Everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Have a good one.